It was futuristic, exotic looking, and as sleek as they came in the late 1930s. Fast and deceptively agile, it left a trail of destruction in its wake and helped conquer the skies in both Europe and the Pacific during World War II. They called it a fighter, but for those unfamiliar with its power, it looked too big for that role. From tip to tip, its wingspan stretched 52 feet, and with twin booms, each 37 feet long, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning dwarfed some light bombers of its day. In fact, fully loaded, it weighed 3 times as much as its principal adversaries, the KI-43 Oscar and BF-109. Yet for all its abundant size in the right hands, the Lightning's lethal combinations of speed, agility, firepower, and durability devastated its opponents. Able to outfly most of its contemporaries, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning blazed a path through aviation history. In the mid-1930s, the United States Army Air Corps could not count a single fighter in its ranks that could effectively combat the latest generation of combat aircraft emerging from Europe. Saddled with the underpowered P-35 and the spry but slow P-36 Hawk, the Air Corps' pursuit squadrons had been given second priority to the bomber groups for most of the decade. The Air Corps issued a new design requirement called Specification X608 to aviation companies in the United States. This document marked the first step in the development of a radical new fighter aircraft.
X608's requirements included a tricycle landing geared fighter that had long range, that was capable of getting to 20,000 feet in under 6 minutes, and have a maximum speed of at least 360 miles an hour. Most importantly, though, it was supposed to incorporate the brand new turbo superchargers then under development that would give it excellent high altitude performance.
Specification X608 landed on the desk of a young designer at Lockheed named Kelly Johnson. Johnson, a 1934 graduate of the University of Michigan, would later design such legendary aircraft as the U-2, the SR-71, and the F-104 Starfighter. X608 would be his first project for the U.S. military.
Kelly Johnson and his staff settled on putting the turbo superchargers directly behind the engines. To do that, they had to use a twin boom design, and it was that design that gave the XP-38 its truly distinctive look.
You consider the P-38 was designed in 1938, or the first model was delivered in 1938. By today's standard, that's pretty primitive. That's a long time ago. And it performed great considering when it was built. It was really a revolutionary idea.
While its layout was unusual, the concept of a twin-engine fighter was not. In Europe, the Germans had taken the lead in long-range fighter development with the Messerschmitt 110. Faster than most single-engine aircraft of the day, the Bf-110 played a significant role as the Luftwaffe's first true multi-role fighter. The British also developed a host of twin-engine fighters, including the Westland Whirlwind, the Blenheim IF, and the Bristol Beaufighter. But what made the P-38 unique were its counter-rotating propellers and tricycle landing gear.
One thing that the aircraft have to contend with is torque, because every horsepower that's trying to rotate the propeller in one direction is trying to turn the airplane in the opposite direction. So with a twin-engine airplane, by having the engines counter-rotate, you neutralize that, And I, for the life of me, can't understand why they would build a twin-engine airplane that didn't have counter-rotating propeller. And any tricycle-geared airplane is much easier to handle on the ground than a tailwheel airplane is. You have good visibility out of it. Like in the P-40, why, you couldn't see anything ahead of you until you got your tail up, so you could see over the nose. But P-39, P-38s, why, you had an excellent view ahead of you all the time.
When you're ready to take a P-38 off, you're already in flying attitude. Your tail's up in the air. A bow fighter, they have a very short nose, two big radial engines that stick out, and they sit with a very sharp tail-down attitude. Now, in a P-38, your tail's already up in the air, so you get full rudder benefit right away the minute you get prop blast on. In a bow fighter, your air doesn't hit your rudder at all. The problem with a bow is you had no rudder. You just had nothing at all for the first two. You got up to about 40 miles an hour, and then your tail came up in the air. Once you got up to 40, then your rudder could take over, but until then, you were using brake to hold the damn thing straight. If you lost an engine, it just invariably the damn thing would invert on you. And I think probably most pilots that were killed in bow fighters were killed because of engine loss on takeoff.
In Asia, the Japanese Army Air Force picked up on the trend and produced the Ki-45 Toryu, or Nick to the Allies. The Nick, like most of the other twin-engine fighters designed just prior to World War II, served in roles never originally envisioned. Combat at the outset of the war showed that twin-engine fighters like the Me-110 and Bristol Beaufighter lacked maneuverability over single-engine types. Within months, they had been relegated from daylight air superiority or escort roles to ground attack and night fighting missions, which suited twin-engine fighters better. Unique among the pre-war crop of twin-engine fighters was the P-38, which never did get pigeonholed into less glamorous roles. The reasons for that stem directly from Kelly Johnson's unique design. From the outset, the Air Corps shrouded the XP-38 program in secrecy. With its aerodynamic lines designed from the outset to minimize drag, Lockheed's Model 22, as it was called, was a futuristic vision straight out of a science fiction story. Nothing else in the world even remotely looked like it. Pilots loved it on sight and grew to appreciate the thoughtful engineering that went into it.
As far as I was concerned, the P-38 was about as well-designed plane as I had ever flown. It was the most reliable as far as I was concerned. The 38 was larger. The accessibility of all the instruments and your controls were seemed to be right in the right spot at wherever they should be. So yes, as far as I was concerned, the layout of the cockpit and the plane itself was excellent.
And it was big. Dwarfing single-engine fighters of the day, the P-38 weighed in at 15,000 pounds. In stark contrast, the Japanese Zero weighed 5,300, and the P-40B weighed 70,000. With its excellent performance, the Air Corps told Lockheed to put it into production. Through 1940 and in 1941, Lockheed's engineers modified and tweaked the design to create a truly combat-ready aircraft. Self-sealing fuel tanks were installed. The original armament system that included 90 caliber T-1 machine guns and a 23 millimeter cannon were scrapped. In their place, Lockheed mounted 4 Browning 50s and a 20 millimeter cannon in the nose. Its armament became one of its key strengths.
The greatest armament of any fighter, I believe. We had 4 50 caliber machine guns in the nose and a 20 millimeter cannon in the nose. And each one of those 50 calibers would shoot within a 6-foot circle at 1,000 yards. So the firepower was absolutely awesome. And you can calculate the amount of firepower. Each one of those 50s would run 600 to 700 rounds per minute. So you've got 4 of them, that's 2,800 rounds a minute of 50 calibers flying around out there, punctuated by a 20 millimeter cannon shell going down through the center of them. When you'd come up behind an enemy aircraft or a ground target, I did a lot of strafing of airfields and airplanes on the ground, trains, and you'd hit a target, the target would just explode. Excellent firepower, much better than probably the 51 or the P-47, even though they had more guns. The 51 had 3 50s in the right wing and 3 in the left wing. They were sighted in to converge at about 300 yards. And optimally, you'd get your target at the 300-yard level, and that would be the highest concentration of firepower. From the P-51 or P-47 happened to have 8 guns, but the principle was the same. But with the P-38, anywhere from out in front of the nose out there to 500 or 600 or 800 yards, you had a tremendous concentration of firepower.
The P-38 had 4 machine guns and 1 cannon. It was all right in the nose. The fire didn't have to be harmonized to meet at a point out there 1,000 feet away or anything. It shot a 3-foot pattern for 2,400 feet. And you could saw a locomotive boiler right in half if you held the trigger down. But we didn't fire that way. We fired like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, because even 2,700 rounds is only about 35, 40 seconds of straight fire, and you'd burn your barrels up in the first place. But boy, it really had firepower.
But even with all that firepower, with the early P-38's, speed was its best advantage. The first combat-ready variant, the P-38E, could reach over 370 miles per hour, making it the fastest fighter in the Air Corps inventory in 1941.
One day I flew the FM, and it was an F-4F then, Grumman Wildcat, and I was about 5,000 feet going along. Here was a swish, and a P-38 went by me. I was going about 250 knots. It was about all that FM2 would do. And here comes that P-38 by me like I was standing still. I thought, boy, there is a machine. I've got to get out of the Navy and join the Air Force.
But with that speed came a potentially fatal disadvantage that would hamper the P-38's performance in the early days of combat: compressibility.
We could not roll over from 30 or 35,000 feet and dive with them, because it would be problematical whether we were going to recover from that dive or not, because we'd exceed the Mach limit of the airplane. We didn't know what Mach limits were in those days. We called it compressibility. But the airplane would tuck under, and you'd get to a point where the airflow over the airfoils were separating, and you could not recover from a dive.
The P-38, as it would come down into a dive, in the dive, it would start accelerating, and at such a high rate of speed, if you didn't pull your power back, you'd get into compressibility, and the tail would start coming over, and you didn't have enough elevator control to pull it out, and you'd keep pulling on the wheel trying to bring it out, and you had to pull your power back. If you stuck with it, as proof, of course, I've done it, you could eventually you could come out of it. The thing would slow down. But there were many people that several things would happen. Either they get compressibility and something would happen, they couldn't pull it out, and they'd just go straight in. And this happened to a number of people. Those people that tried to bail out, everybody thought that it was dangerous and that you would just wrap around the tail. At certain speeds, most speeds that you were flying the aircraft at, if you did have to bail out, you went under the tail, just like any normal aircraft. However, if you were going at an exceptionally high speed, and I'd estimate something over 400 miles an hour, that was high speed in those days, you'd go over the tail. Of course, there's that intermediate place that you might go half over and half under, too. Compressibility was a problem in that aircraft, but if you knew what you were doing, generally you could always get it out.
Lockheed studied the compressibility problem and eventually conquered it with a clever design addition.
They developed some dive brakes, speed brakes. They call them dive recovery flaps, operated electrically, and that helped the problem quite a bit.
They call them dive brakes or dive flaps. That if you got into compressibility state, all you had to do was to flip those on, and it would slow you down and get you right out of it. No question about it.
But before the problem of compressibility was solved, the P-38 Lightnings would see their fair share of combat. Within months of Pearl Harbor, the P-38 was ready to be deployed overseas, and how it fared in combat against determined enemies like the Germans and Japanese remained to be seen. When the United States entered World War II, the P-38 was just reaching operational status. Ironically, the first P-38 equipped squadron to reach combat proved not to be the fighter version, but a photo reconnaissance variant called the F-5. As part of the 8th Photo Recon Group, the F-5 went into action in the Southwest Pacific in the spring of 1942. Fast and capable of flying at extreme altitudes, the Japanese had no aircraft that could intercept it. As a fighter, the first time the P-38 saw action was in the summer of 1942, when the Air Corps deployed the 54th Fighter Squadron to the Aleutians. The 54th earned the distinction of being the first squadron of P-38Es in combat. But conditions in the theater were grueling on both men and machines.
You leave the ground with a 30-minute flight, and 5 minutes after you're off of the ground, you can't see it. And the winds are blowing so hard you couldn't land in it if you could. And it's one of those things that you didn't enjoy trying to get back to the base in. But, you get used to landing and not seeing the ground out there. It's just part of flying out there. I had the ground control later when ground control got established. One of those guys talked me down. He said, "You're 50 feet over the center of the runway, level off." And he was right. But I never did see the ground, and I couldn't see it after I was on it. Weather was the big enemy.
Shortly afterward, other P-38 squadrons joined the fight against the Japanese. The 39th Fighter Squadron was sent to New Guinea, and elements of the 347th Fighter Group went into action at Guadalcanal. These P-38 pilots quickly discovered how best to fight the Japanese with their new planes.
You never, ever try to turn with a zero. And they teach you that right off.
Getting in the desired position of high to the rear and have the sun to your back was the main criteria. And then diving on the planes. You didn't always have that opportunity, but if you were to get in combat, you would go in and make a pass, fire, and then break off.
When we were in the P-38 and fighting the Japanese Zeros, we would usually try to get in behind them and fire that way. But if they started turning
and they could turn much shorter circles than we did. So we would just pull off and pull up and come back and go after them, rather than try to turn with them, because they could outturn you.
As the men in the Pacific learned the strengths and weaknesses of the P-38, the P-38 pilots fighting the Germans faced a steep learning curve. The first P-38 Lightning groups into action against the Luftwaffe were the 14th and 1st in North Africa, and were all but slaughtered.
In North Africa, many of the American squadrons went into action with really very little tactical understanding of the Germans or how to fight them. And thus, as the campaign progressed, they adopted British tactics. Well, the P-38 guys couldn't do that because British tactics were designed for agile aircraft and weren't really designed for energy fighters like the P-38. So as a result, over the first few months of the North Africa campaign, the two P-38 groups suffered very heavy losses, and it took time to work out how best to use the P-38 to its greatest effect against the Luftwaffe.
In England, the first P-38 groups to join the 8th Air Force soon discovered they had their hands full fighting the Luftwaffe while trying to protect the 8th's heavy bombers over Europe. On top of having to fight an experienced and aggressive enemy, the freezing cold encountered during high-altitude escort missions affected the P-38's Allison engines, sometimes causing them to fail.
The temperatures were frequently at minus 60 Fahrenheit, and maybe lower than that, because the outside air temperature gauge on the instrument panel in the P-38 only went to minus 60, and I have frequently seen the needle pegged at minus 60. The airplane was equipped with 2 Allison engines, and we call them Allison time bombs, not without reason. Have you heard that expression before? You talk to some P-38 drivers out of Europe and mention Allison time bombs, and they'll know what you're talking about. But the engines did not like the cold temperature. They'd backfire, and I think there were some lubrication problems. One time I had a rod fail, and the piston and everything just went right, or the rod just went right out the side of the airplane. And engine failures were not uncommon.
As escorts for the 8th Air Force bombers, the P-38 Lightning did not shine. Frequently, they were caught from above and behind by Luftwaffe fighters. Entirely defensive, it was all the Americans could do just to stay alive.
They were always at an advantage. There was the sun, and all bogies came from there. That was a time for some of us to drop fuel tanks, belly tanks, and turn into them. It was an anxious time. We had a terrific amount of gun power. They didn't like the front end of a P-38. For a while there, we thought the Germans were after us instead of the bombers. It was their show there for quite a bit.
Lockheed set about trying to boost the P-38's performance to give American pilots the edge. Some of the first improvements came with the P-38H model, which gave the Lightning a significant speed advantage over the BF-109 and FW-190A.
The top speed of a P-38, if you dove it down, picked up as much speed as you could, have the throttles wide open, you could get an honest 425 miles an hour out of it. Probably in a dive, I'm sure that some of the 38s must have hit at least 500 miles an hour, maybe more.
The additional power in the H model paved the way for the J, another substantial improvement on the original design.
The J model P-38, which was one of the most widely used, incorporated larger engines, so it was a little bit faster than the other models, and it was a little bit more reliable in cold weather. It had solved some of the issues with the Allison engines that had plagued the earlier P-38 outfits over in Northern Europe.
While still large and not as maneuverable as a single-engine fighter, when flown properly, the P-38 could whip anything in the sky. This point was driven home to Dick Heyman, who witnessed a unique demonstration of the Lightning's abilities.
John Lowell made an arrangement with a Spitfire pilot. He would meet over the field, and the two of them would fly mock combat right over over our field. And it was just a morale booster, or confidence booster, I guess, for all of us, and especially for the replacement pilots. And John got up there, and the Spitfire was a very maneuverable airplane, but John Lowell was just one hell of a pilot, and he just flat waxed that Spitfire pilot.
When unchained from the heavy bombers, the P-38 pilots now enjoyed considerable advantages over the Luftwaffe's best fighters.
They couldn't outdive us, they couldn't outrun us, but they could sure outturn us. So when you have an aircraft like that you're fighting or come up against, you have to use what you're capable of as opposed to fighting his fight. We could outdive him, we could outclimb him, but we couldn't outturn him. So we didn't try to get into tight turns with him. We might make one or two turns, and then we better either take our advantage of diving or climbing and to get back in the fight again. If you fall sucker to flying their fight, you're dead meat. We had to use what we had to our advantage as opposed to what they had.
While the 8th struggled with their P-38s for much of the war, the 9th Air Force used their Lightnings with considerable success. The 9th's tactical role suited the Lightning better. Flying at slightly lower altitudes, the engine did not fail nearly as often as with the 8th Air Force P-38s. Also, the 9th's groups escorted fast B-26s, which allowed the P-38s to keep their speed up and be less vulnerable to surprise attack.
Those B-26s, boy, they were easy to escort for us because they flew fast, and they really got close together, and you could escort a group of them with a squadron of P-38s and cover them real well, you know. And those B-24s, Jesus, they were scattered all over the sky. And the B-17s, they flew good formation. But the B-24s, my God, they were wandering all over the sky, you know.
In early 1944, the Army Air Corps began experimenting with fighter-bomber versions of the P-38. In fact, some Lightnings were converted into level bombers and were even given Norden bomb sights.
They took P-38 and they put a bombardier. We had one that didn't have any guns in it, but it had a glass nose and a place for a bombardier. And they was trying this out, thinking they could pattern bomb something with P-38s.
Lockheed produced only a few droop snoot Lightnings. In the meantime, the main production variants, most notably the P-38J, were adapted for ground attack roles. The Army Air Corps installed bomb racks and discovered that the Lightning could carry aloft more ordnance than any other fighter.
We could carry up to 6,000 pounds of bombs, but usually the most we carried was 4. And many times, most missions, 2 1,000-pound bombs, and 8 rockets, 8 of those 4-inch rockets underneath the wings.
38 carried a lot more than the 51 in the way of weight. We could sling, if we didn't carry a belly tank under one side, you could put two 2,000-pound pieces of armament on each of the nacelles underneath. Whether they were landmine type things for concussion or 2,000-pound bombs. We had one configuration, it carried 3 500-pounders under each side, so you carry 3,000 pounds of 500, carry 6 of them, the rack. So it was a good airplane for carrying weight.
With rockets under the wings and 1,000-pound bombs between the booms, the P-38 proved to be a formidable weapon against infantry, tanks, trucks, and trains. It would be in this role that the P-38 more than proved its worth through 1944. With swift, shallow dives, Lightning pilots could pounce on anything that moved along the French countryside.
It was a perfect strafing platform. It had lots of firepower and it was real stable. And you could, that's just all there is to it.
Nothing was safe. However, the P-38 made a large target for German anti-aircraft gunners, and casualties mounted.
Anytime I'm down among the trees and telephone poles shooting up ground targets, I wanted to be in a P-38 firepower, 2 engines. Now, keep in mind, these are liquid-cooled engines with a lot of plumbing that a small flak or some guy on the ground with a 30 caliber rifle, if he put a round into you at the right place, he could bring you down because of the liquid-cooled characteristics of the engine. So in a P-51, they only had half the chance of getting an engine shot out because they only had one, but we had 2 of them. But we also had that spare engine to come home on when one of the engines, for whatever reason, were damaged or a round into a coolant line somewhere caused the pilot to shut the airplane down, or the engine down, to bring his airplane home. But the P-38 was a great ground attack airplane. Absolutely great airplane.
At the same time, anything in the air was fair game for the aggressive P-38 pilots who piled on their German opponents.
When we looked off to the east, a whole bunch of ME-109s, about 20 of them, were attacking 4 P-47s. Coming down, boy, just like rain down out of the sky. And so we flew over there and got in the fight, and we shot down 8 of them.
In mid-1944, a revolutionary version of the P-38 reached frontline units and gave the 38 almost every advantage in a straight-up dogfight. Dubbed the P-38L, Lockheed had incorporated hydraulically boosted controls.
The aileron boost in a P-38L was nothing more than hydraulics boosting the aileron controls. And if you see, the P-38 was the only, as far as I know, the only fighter we ever had that had a wheel instead of just a stick. We always flew still with one hand, just like it was a stick, but anyhow, it was a wheel. And you could actually roll, or using that wheel, you could roll it somewhere around 300 degrees per second. You could really move it fast. That boost would just move those ailerons right now, and you could really roll the aircraft fast. The faster you go, the stiffer the controls get. If you're going really fast, it takes all the muscle you have with a manual operated aircraft or system to roll the aircraft, to turn it. But with that hydraulic boost, any weakling can do it. That was a big advantage.
The L was the ultimate of the P-38, the L and the L5, of course. It gave you aileron boost, which gave you a much quicker reaction and no muscling of the controls to get it to fly the direction you wanted it or make turns. And also the other main part, the L5 had a radar off the tail end of it on a 30-degree cone that if any plane, enemy or your own, got within that area with that radar on, it would flash a light on the cockpit panel and buzzing in your ears, so you'd know immediately there was enemy behind you.
Devastating as the L model could be against the Luftwaffe, the P-38's greatest successes took place not over the hostile skies of Europe, but against the Japanese in the vast expanse of the Pacific. Throughout 1943, the 5th and 13th Air Forces begged Washington for more P-38s. With their 4 to 5 hour endurance, terrific speed, and high altitude performance, the air leaders in the Southwest Pacific quickly recognized the Lightning as the weapon they needed to destroy the Japanese air forces. But because most P-38s were diverted to the European theater, they were slow to arrive. Thus, every P-38 in the Pacific was a precious commodity. Nevertheless, by March 1944, the 5th Air Force had several P-38 groups, including the 475th Fighter Group, battling the Japanese over the Pacific. The P-38s soon cut a wide swath through the Japanese Army Air Force and Navy units in the South Pacific. Hundreds fell before their guns, and for almost 18 months, a new Lightning Ace was made almost daily. In fact, the top American aces of the war flew P-38s against the Japanese.
The P-38 was used with tremendous success in the Southwest Pacific Theater, and naturally a whole host of aces were created within the P-38 units. The most notable of those included Dick Bong, with 40 planes to his credit, the top American ace, Tommy McGuire with 38, the second leading ace in American history, and Charles McDonald, who had 27 planes to his credit, and Gerald R. Johnson, who had 24 planes to his credit. All of these guys shared one thing in common. They not only flew P-38s for the bulk of their air-to-air victories, but they were also uniquely skilled in the air, and they were aggressive aviators.
The P-38 inspired great confidence in all its pilots, especially given the distances and amount of water the aviators had to fly over in the Pacific Theater.
The flying of it, especially overseas in the Pacific, the two engines was a godsend for me. Flying over all that water and the distances we had to fly, the 38 was an outstanding plane as far as I was concerned.
Secure in the knowledge that they possessed a better airplane, the Lightning pilots waded into the Japanese at every opportunity.
We were circling around the bombers, and I saw a Japanese plane below the bombers coming up. I circled around behind him, came in below him, and pulled up, fired into him, and fired into the wing on the right-hand side. The wing came off right near the fuselage and flew by on my right-hand side, and he went on down. But it was a very easy kill because I don't think he ever saw me.
As we approached Ormoc Bay, we saw a flight of 6 fighters, Japanese fighters, and I called them in 11 o'clock high, and Captain Treadway, the leader, he says, "Yes, I see them." And we then kept on the direction we were going and positioned ourselves behind them and high in the sun. And as we dove out of the sun onto them, why, we came up on them too fast. Captain Treadway says, "We're moving in too fast, throttle back." And we cut back, and just about that time, he fired, and one of them blew up. He pulled off to the right. And just as that happened, they started banking left. I fired at the next plane, and he rolled out straight and level. And by this time, the speed I had, I was down under him, and I came up underneath him. And the gun sight is about 2.5 inches diameter. And that gun sight covered you couldn't get the nacelle of the Japanese plane in that gun sight. I was so close. So I fired and shoved the stick forward, and I ducked, and the plane blew up right over my head. I missed him by about 10 or 15 feet.
In the summer of 1944, Charles Lindbergh arrived in the theater to teach American pilots how to extend their range. Lindbergh's innovative ideas changed the nature of P-38 operations for the rest of the war.
Charles Lindbergh was over there as a tech rep for Pratt & Whitney engines, and he found that with both the P-47 and the P-38, we weren't getting near the mileage that he thought that we should get on the fuel we were using. And so he was a very smart engineer, and he worked it out. And the P-38, he figured that what we needed to do was pull back on the throttles and pull back on the mixture control and the RPMs. And you would start easing back on that mixture control till the engine would get rough. Then you would stop there and move it forward a bit and do the same with the other engine. And we got fantastic mileage out of the planes from then on. And that made Borneo possible.
Thanks to Lindbergh's teachings, the 5th Air Force was now able to escort the ultra-long-range bombing missions against the largest oil production facility in the Japanese Empire, Balikpapan, Borneo.
The bombers were going into to Balikpapan, and they were just getting tore up very bad. And they had told Bomber Command that they just didn't want to go to Borneo anymore, and unless they had fighter escort. And so they said that they would get fighter escort on the next mission. So that was when we went to Borneo. And so we went up over Borneo, and we covered the bombers until they went over the target. And as it always was with fighter pilots, we were very lucky. We didn't have to go over the target with the bombers, and we stayed on the outside and around them. And they bombed, and what few fighter planes got in the air, I think we shot every one of them down. The 9th Squadron shot down 6, and there was a P-47 group went over, and I think they shot down about 18 more.
Those missions were the longest the 5th Air Force ever flew. As a weapon of air superiority and power projection, the P-38 had no equal in the Pacific. Yet during the invasion of the Philippines, the Pacific Lightnings came into their own as fighter bombers.
We did a lot of ground support in northern Luzon there, supporting the infantry. And basically 2 things. We carried napalm for a lot of our missions to bomb with napalm, and we also did a lot of strafing.
It was kind of a crude arrangement back in those days. They used, if they had duct tape, they would have used duct tape then, but they had electrician tape, the old black electrician's tape. And they would tape a percussion grenade on and a phosphorus grenade on. And the regular wires that pull the bomb pin would also pull the pins on the grenades.
No Army Air Corps fighter contributed more to victory in the Pacific than did the P-38. Its superb performance, excellent speed, and astonishing range simply had no rival in Japanese markets. Yet, for all its contributions to victory, the P-38 is best remembered for one single day, at a time when final victory itself was still in doubt. Even though the P-38 served everywhere from North Africa to Europe to China, Burma, India, and the Pacific, it's still remembered mainly for one stunning mission that took place on April 18th, 1943.
Admiral Yamamoto was the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack and served as the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, which was their main striking force within the Japanese Navy. And in April of 1943, American codebreakers discovered that he was going to the South Pacific to inspect the survivors of the Guadalcanal campaign. And as a result, the decision was made to try to shoot his plane down while he was on this inspection trip in the Solomon Islands.
It turned out to be probably as fine of executed fighter mission that's ever been pulled from the timeliness of it. I got in on the briefing that the Navy conducted once they broke the code, and they were trying to decide whether there was any particular way we could catch them. They decided, well, we got these P-38s, and if we had a little bigger tanks, fuel tanks, we could make that. So we decided that they were going to do it. So Mitchell, who was our best authority on the theater, was selected to leave the flight and to plan the mission.
Mitchell and Vixilio was our group commander, Mitchell was our squadron commander, and so we were sitting around our tents, and so Mitchell told us to lay off the booze tonight and to be ready to get up in the morning and go on a very important mission. He didn't tell us what it was.
On the morning of April 18, 1943, the 16 P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron left Guadalcanal and headed out on the deck to their rendezvous with Yamamoto.
We got up about 6 o'clock in the morning, reported to him, and he laid the mission out, what we would do. He assigned 4 of us to what they called the killer section that would go in on his airplanes, and the rest of them would follow him up in the air to give us top cover. And I was in the killer section, Lanphier was in the killer section, and 2 other boys were in the killer section, 4 altogether. You see, Mitchell had to navigate over the water and away from land so they wouldn't pick up the fact that we were coming up, the Japanese. But we called it a 1 in 100 chance of intercepting, because when you fly out over the water with nothing to refer to but your compass and airspeed indicator, you'd be very lucky to intercept anybody. But Mitchell was a tremendous pilot.
Just after 11 a.m., right on schedule, the Japanese formation appeared off to the left of the wave-hugging P-38s.
We hit exactly where Mitchell wanted and exactly the time he was, and there was Yamamoto's airplane coming down also.
Doug Canning says bogeys 10 o'clock high. I looked up there, and there was these 2 bombers and 6 fighters. The fighters were flying in a V formation, 3-ship V. We immediately dropped belly tanks, switched fuel, dropped belly tanks, and started our climb. Well, all the time that I was climbing, Barbara and whatnot were in there engaged in the shooting down, and they were low.
Killer sections started after him, and Lanphier was leading, and I was flying alongside his wing. We were flying in together, and Lanphier, as we were approaching, turned left into the zeros, and I chased this bomber. I caught up with it, and it was followed also by a couple of zeros, but they are a little bit far behind, so I got my shots in before they caught me. And it was burning badly and going downhill, so I was sure it was shot down. The other zeros started catching up with me, and so I had to take a little evasive action. As I hurried to the coast, there was this other Betty just going along the edge of the shore. So I dropped in behind the bomber, and well, it exploded almost immediately. Another zero came along, and Besby Holmes did shoot one down, and the other one came right on underneath me, and I rolled over and shot him down. Then we headed for home.
So as the engagement begins, Lanphier and his wingmen break in to the Japanese fighters. Rex Barber and Besby Holmes over here, they break after the bombers. So now the killer flight is split, and Lanphier and Hine, they make a head-on pass on the Japanese fighters covering Yamamoto's plane, while Rex Barber and Besby Holmes go after the actual targets. The moment Lanphier landed at Guadalcanal, he climbed out of the cockpit and claimed he had shot down Yamamoto's plane. Well, there was no way he could have known which plane that Yamamoto was in, but he wrote the documentation the squadron produced on the mission and then spent the rest of his life trying to use the Yamamoto mission to further his own political career. So somewhere the truth got lost here, and in subsequent analyses of the mission, it's very clear that there's no way Lanphier actually scored this kill based on his own description of it.
Here was a case of two airplanes firing at the same aircraft, and both of them thinking, I got it. Now, hindsight later, when I review the history and what Barber said and his tactics, they made good sense to me. What Lanphier said, don't. I claim that Lanphier, I won't call him a liar because I'd say he lived a perfect fantasy. He thought he did something. He stated what he thought. The military accepted what he thought, and that's it. But unfortunately, it's wrong.
Regardless of the controversy, the outcome was still the same. Admiral Yamamoto, the man behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, was dead. Yamamoto's plane was but one of some 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed by P-38s in the Pacific alone. In a little over 2 years of combat, fewer than 10 Lightning groups virtually decimated the bulk of the Japanese Army Air Force. Yet when the war ended in August of 1945, the Lightning's high cost ensured there would be no place for it in the post-war era. Almost as soon as the fighting ended, the P-38 disappeared from the Army Air Corps' inventory. Today, only a small fraction of the 8,800 built survive. Less than a dozen are still in flying condition, last reminders of a plane that once helped change the course of history. Great aircraft define aviation history, and the P-38 is one of those great airplanes. In Europe, the P-38 helped destroy the German Air Force in the sky and played a vital part in shutting down the potent German army on the ground. In the Pacific, the Lightning was a war winner. It took the war to the Japanese Empire and crushed all opposition it faced, and that remains its most significant accomplishment. The P-38 deserved every accolade it received after the war, and even decades later, its pilots remember it with deep affection. Flying a truly unique aircraft, the P-38 Lightning pilots had their lives defined by their experience in its cockpit.
In my wildest dreams as a kid, I never thought I'd be in a plane like that. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven.
I'm a 38 pilot. I'll always be a 38 pilot, and you know, that's my first love and my last love.